Hello everyone, just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I don't claim that my builds are the best in the game, and I'm sure there are better ways to optimize some of them, but be aware that I do tend to get my builds at least endgame viable. This includes things like arbitration, steel path, eidolon hunts, etc. Now that this is out of the way, these timestamps have been left here and in the description for your convenience. Feel free to skip around, but I'll start with the basics first just in case people don't know how to play this frame. So as usual, we are starting with the stats. Armor is 275 for prime and 225 for non-prime. In terms of damage reduction, this is 47.8% and 42.9% respectively. For damage reduction, this doesn't really matter. However, he has an ability that scales off of armor, so prime could be worth investing into for this reason. For energy, we have a stock 100 for both. This is 150 at max. For health, you're looking at a stock 100 for both. This is 300 at max. For shield, you're looking at 150 for both, which brings you to 450 for both. For sprint speed, you're looking at 1.0 for prime and 0.95 for non-prime. As most of you know, sprint speed doesn't really matter in this game. Just bullet jump everywhere and you're fine. In terms of acquisition, regular Rhino comes from the Jackal boss fight on Venus, and Rhino Prime is currently unvaulted at the time of this video creation, but he won't be for long. Grab him while you can. If not, you'll have to buy him from somebody else. Moving on to his ability, starting with the passive. Emit a shockwave, dealing 100 damage after landing from a great height. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. If you fall from a height that would otherwise make you have a hard landing, you knock down enemies around you in a pretty pitiful range. It even pretends to do damage on impact, so that's cool. Moving on to his next ability, Rhino Charge. Rhino charges towards the target, clobbering any in his path and goring his victim. So you press it, and you charge. It tosses enemies in the path you took, as well as dealing impact damage to those enemies. This is pretty straightforward, but there are a couple things to know. So while charging, Rhino is temporarily immune, and when cast, a combo window is displayed in the middle of the screen at the bottom. During this window, Rhino Charge does 2 times or 4 times damage, depending on how many times you cast it. During the 2 times combo, Rhino Charges cost half energy, and at 4 times combo, it costs 75% less energy. If Rhino's second ability is active, Rhino Charge hits enemies with a guaranteed blast proc, which reduces the accuracy of enemies by 30%. Additionally, enemies affected by his fourth ability take double damage from Rhino Charge. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, distance per second is not affected by mods, range and radius of enemies hit around Rhino is affected by ability range, damage is affected by ability strength, combo window duration is affected by ability duration. Moving into his second ability, Iron Skin, Rhino hardens his skin, insulating himself from all damage. So you cast this, and for the next 3 seconds, Rhino absorbs all damage to add to the Iron Skin. Because the absorbed damage is additive to the rest of the formula for calculating Iron Skin health, it's more important to have a good number in general than worrying about taking damage during this time. The only time you should worry about taking damage during this is when you know you can absorb just an absurd amount of damage quickly, like from a void laser, for example. Other than that, absorb damage plays a pretty minimal part in Iron Skin health compared to what you can otherwise get. Once the absorb phase is over, you are granted an additional health bar, which shields your health and shields. This extra health bar is displayed in the top right with the rest of the buffs in the game. The health is also represented as a percent in correlation to the original value on the ability bar. It's worth noting the health of Iron Skin does not have damage reduction naturally applied to it like other things. Things like adaptation and other damage reduction abilities on Rhino do not affect how much damage Iron Skin takes. While active, Rhino is immune to knockdown effects and staggers, as well as other status effects like being on fire. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, the health of Iron Skin is affected by ability strength and armor modifiers, Time Invulnerable is not affected by mods. It's worth mentioning accent color on Rhino affects the color he is when it is active, because brighter colors can make it visibly easier to tell when it's down for some people. Going on to his third ability, RAWR, grants all nearby warframes increased damage for a short time. So you press 3 and, well, he roars. This makes everybody affected get a roar buff that multiplies everyone's damage by whatever the number says. It's worth noting that this is not ability strength, rather just a damage multiplier that works for both abilities and weapons. If your allies fall off an edge and get reset or respawn, this buff will go away until Rhino recasts. This causes Rhino to need to also fall off a ledge or revive to be able to recast before the duration is over. This ability really is super straightforward though. You press a button, get and give damage. That's pretty much how it goes. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, Duration is affected by ability duration, Radius is affected by range, and Damage multiplier is affected by ability strength. This is also the subsumed ability when given to the Helmet. Moving on to Rhino's fourth ability, Rhino Stomp. Rhino stomps with force sufficient to disrupt time, tumbling enemies around him in stasis. So, Rhino stomps. Enemies in the area are dealt blast damage and suspended in the air, and enemies that are closer to the stomp itself take another instance of damage. Enemies that get hit are also slowed by a significant amount. If you decide to recast this ability on enemies that are already affected, they will not be affected again until the duration of the stun has run out, in which case you'll need to cast again. In terms of modding for this ability, Drain is affected by ability efficiency, Damage is affected by ability strength, Radius is affected by ability range, and Duration is affected by ability duration. Okay, moving on to ability augments, starting with Ironclad Charge, Rhino Charge Augment. Each enemy hit increases Rhino's armor rating by 50% for 10 seconds. So as you may imagine, hitting multiple enemies increases Rhino's armor by a ton, and we know that Iron Skin is affected by armor multipliers, so yeah, this is really fucking good. So let's say I have a stock 1.8k Iron Skin. As a quick example, if I hit a bunch of enemies with this and cast Iron Skin, even with no mods except for Ironclad Charge, this thing ramps up that skin health like crazy. So yeah, it's pretty damn good. It relies on a bunch of enemies being in the same area, so it's less effective in things like Index and stuff, but still. Ability strength does in fact affect the armor increase. Duration of the increase is affected by ability duration. Moving on to his second ability augment, Iron Shrapnel. Iron Skin augment. Recasting Iron Skin will cause it to detonate, dealing 100% of its remaining health as puncture damage and knocking down enemies. So I mean, you may think it's not great, but you can't actually recast Iron Skin without this. So this unlocks a huge quality of life for Rhino. Being able to drop a low health skin before it gets you killed and being able to properly refresh it whenever is actually a big deal. Additionally, as a gimmick, because it's a conclave mod, it deals the remaining damage as puncture damage, which has a chance to cause a status effect, which reduces target's damage by 30%. When you push really crazy Iron Skin numbers, it can actually be a bit comical to drop an Iron Skin when surrounded by enemies, as it just deletes them. Like I said, it's a gimmick, but it's kind of funny that it actually works in PvE. Moving on to his next augment, Piercing Roar. Roar augment, enemies within 25 meters will be knocked down and suffer from a puncture status effect. Roar can be recast, so of course otherwise you would normally be able to recast Roar, just like Iron Skin. The puncture status obviously reduces target's damage in the area by 30%. Being able to recast this helps, as sometimes people fall off edges after being given it, so they of course lose it. It's hard to find mod slots for this on casual builds, but for Roar builds specifically, I guess it can be okay. The damage dealt is pretty low at 150, but is affected by strength mods. The 25 meter range is affected by ability range. The puncture proc is even affected by ability duration. The default duration for a puncture proc is 6 seconds. Moving on to his next augment and last, Reinforcing Stomp. Rhino Stomp augment, Iron Skin health is replenished by 80 for each enemy affected. So notice the word replenish. Well, replenish means to replace something you've lost, not augment it further. So basically you can't add more Iron Skin. It is capped at whatever you got when you casted it. So if I casted a 6k Iron Skin and spam Stomp 100 times at 300% strength, it still won't go over 6k. The health per enemy is affected by ability strength, but because of this limit, I really don't recommend this augment, to be honest. At this point in the video, I like to answer the question, is this frame Steel Path viable? Can it run arbitrations? Is it part of the Eidolon hunts? I mean, I guess the damage is pretty good for Eidolon hunts. It's not exactly the most popular choice, but I suppose it could work, especially if you got the ability Smite from Helmet with the augment. That could be quite a bit of good damage. Aside from that, in other content, he's fantastic. Being easy to get early in the game and allowing you to go through the star chart with ease makes him super desirable sooner rather than later. If you get a proper build, he is capable of other things like focus farming, being an ultra tank and damage boost in Steel Path and arbitrations, and even allows you to have great crowd control with his fourth ability. Overall, he's super strong and his augments really help too. As a quick disclaimer before we get into the builds, I have a lot of builds for Rhino. Because I have so many builds, not all of them are at their peak performance. However, they get you through the endgame content like a breeze, and that's the goal. Making them all work together was the priority here, not min-max. I don't need 5 Rhinos for each different task that I want to do. For example, my Iron Skin build can hit ridiculous health numbers that would barely get scratched, but it's certainly not the highest you can get. My RAWR build gives you nearly 200% RAWR, which is more than any public group I've ever been in for Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, but of course, you can get higher than this. With all that out of the way, let's get into the builds. So starting with the first build, this is my Iron Skin build. This build is designed to just take a ton of hits. Even at super endgame content, I push ridiculous Iron Skin numbers with it. Towards the end of this, I'll show an easy 733k Iron Skin. Like I mentioned earlier, you can get higher, but it is what it is. I like to be able to use all my builds, not just one. In terms of helmet, you're going to want parasitic armor. This isn't totally needed, however, it means the difference of having almost double the Iron Skin health. If you can't do this ability in particular, but have access to helmet, I would recommend Elemental Ward or Defy. For Elemental Ward, you just want to make sure your appearance color makes you get the cold type for the bonus armor. These aren't as strong as parasitic armor, but it is significantly better than nothing. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 5 Forma. You'll add 3 Nariman, one of which will go on the Aura. Obviously, the Aura is a bit more optional, but I recommend it or an Aura Forma if you want something else, as my other builds use a Nariman on the Aura as well. Additionally, you'll add 2 Matarai, both of which will replace the default Vazarins. So going over the mods, starting with the Aura. Enemy radar, I like to just be able to see where the enemies are at when I can, get a good setup on my Iron Skin going. It definitely helps. Obviously, you can do other things. This is just what I prefer. Starting with Umber Intensify, we obviously just want to boost his strength as much as possible. And then we have the 2 Augments, Ironclad Charge and Iron Shrapnel. So Charge, as I mentioned earlier, it increases your armor rating by a shit ton. It's really important to use this to get higher Iron Skin, and Iron Shrapnel just gives you the luxury of being able to recast it, without getting totally screwed. You can do it at your own convenience. Next, I have Transient Fortitude to push the strength even further. Obviously, this brings the duration down a bit, but that's actually not that important. Parasitic armor and the other things actually last a fair bit of time, so it's not a big deal. These 3 mods. So, Stretch, Flow, and Streamline. I opted to utility mods like this. However, you could change up the build to get other things like more strength and armor, but I find this more convenient for leisurely play, which Rhino is pretty damn good at since he can just kick back with his Iron Skin. Lastly, I opted in for Blind Rage. This just gives you a ton of strength. Rhino needs a ton of strength pretty much on all of his builds, so here we are. Arcanes. In terms of Arcanes, you're going to want Arcane Tanker. This just gives way too much Iron Skin health to be optional. It's super easy to trigger, lasts forever, and can mean the difference of a 429k Iron Skin without it versus a 733k Iron Skin with it. The reason why we don't use Guardian here is because Guardian can't trigger if your Iron Skin is already up. And typically it's going to be up so you don't get one shot. There are also people that use Ultimatum, which is really good as well on top of Tanker. This can push you to and past 1 million Iron Skins. However, I find that I am lazy as hell when I play Rhino, because that's how I play him, so I don't use this. Do whatever suits you. In terms of misc requirements, I would say using something that can pull enemies in can help get a beefy Iron Skin right at the start. Things like Magus Anomaly, Exodia Hunt on Zaws, or even Xenuric Void Singularity will do the trick. In terms of Operator School, this is more down to preference. I use Xenuric just because, but an RO can actually give you slightly higher Iron Skin because of a passive it has that increases armor by a tiny bit. It's really not much. Do whatever. So a quick how to use, you get in, get some energy, get your tanker buff going, and then you cast a basic Iron Skin just to keep yourself alive. Next, pull enemies in close, hit as many dudes with the charge as you can, press Parasitic Armor, and then press Iron Skin. From here, you can drop your Parasitic Armor early if you want. However, your skin should last long enough to not have to worry about that. So here I go into some gameplay kind of showing my setup when I'm actually in a mission. So I had a decent Iron Skin going, and then I was just kind of waiting it out, preparing for a better one. So I cast my arch gun to get my tanker buff, and then I just put it away. I press parasitic armor a little early here. Typically you want to give yourself a bit of extra time, but that's fine. So I charge, get a huge charge, and that is almost 1,000,000 on the iron skin. So obviously that is enough to just kind of be able to sit through the rest of the mission. A little bit later on, I decided to show me just kind of, you know, standing in front of an acolyte and not really taking much damage. I just kind of chill. Apparently he is too, trying to dodge away from nothing. Then of course I decide to shoot him. He really didn't do that much damage to the skin. So that is how that goes. Moving on to my next build, which is my RAWR build. This build is designed to just be a fat RAWR. This is mostly intended for Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. Obviously, this isn't the highest RAWR you can get, as mentioned in the disclaimer, but it's almost always more than you will find in a public run. This gives a 194% RAWR. In terms of Helminth, you're going to want Empower. This just gives a flat 50% extra strength to RAWR, which is quite obvious as to why we would want this. It's unlocked super early in the Helminth as well. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 5 Forma. You'll add 3 Nariman, one of which will go on the Aura. Obviously, the Aura is a bit more optional, but I recommend it or an Aura Forma if you want something else, as my other builds use a Nariman on the Aura as well. Additionally, you'll add 2 Matarai, both of which will replace the default Vazarins. Going over the mods, starting with Corrosive Projection. I would say Corrosive Projection is probably best since it's geared towards Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, and the armor values typically aren't too high, so with everyone running it, you can get a pretty solid strip. However, even then, if everybody in the group ran Power Donation, that would actually be a bit better. Going over the rest of the mods, starting with Intensify, we obviously just want to boost our strength a bunch, which we are. Next mod is Continuity. Optionally, instead of this, you could actually run Piercing Roar, as it has a bit of utility of reducing enemy damage around you as you are coming through a portal. I would say being able to recast your Roar because maybe somebody missed it is quite nice. Just bear in mind, you'll be hitting Roar quite a bit more, but at least you'll be able to recast. Next, I have Augur Message. I just paired this with a regular Continuity because I wasn't going to Forma again just to fit Continuity. And putting this here obviously brings me up to what Prime Continuity would bring me. So that's, yeah, good duration, so we're not having to recast this all the time. Next, we have Blind Rage, which brings up our strength. The efficiency doesn't really matter. Typically, if you're running a proper Elite Sanctuary Onslaught build, or a group, an optimized group for it, you'll be having a Trinity in the group to give you energy. Next, we have Stretch, just in case maybe you're paired with a Saren who has to go off and spread her spores. You'll most likely still hit them if you have this. This is totally utility. You could actually replace this with something else, but I would recommend keeping it on. Next, we have Constitution, which basically helps counteract the Transient Fortitude, because obviously that's a bit of a problem. Next, we have Augur Secrets, just to boost our strength a bit more, as well as Transient Fortitude, which does that even more. And again, it reduces our duration, but that's why we have Constitution there for. And lastly, we have Power Drift to further increase our strength, bringing us to a total of 337%, which is pretty solid. In terms of Arcanes, you're going to want really anything. Anything is really just a bonus. These aren't super required. In terms of misc requirements, just run 2 of the best lenses you can, one on Rhino, one on a weapon, and bring absolutely nothing else, because your XP obviously gets split if you're running other things and they don't even have a lens. I would have an empty loadout unless you have a Smita, which can occasionally give you double affinity, which applies to focus. In terms of Operator School, Zenuric is okay for when the Trinity is sleeping, but typically Vazarin is good to get instant revives on yourself and others, as anybody being dead in the beginning of a round can cause serious focus loss, so that is also a pretty good option. So, a quick how to use. You get some energy from your Trinity or whatever, press Empower, press RAWR, and Profit. That's really all there is to it. I do not need to go into gameplay to explain how to use this in Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. Just find yourself a relatively optimized group. You would ideally want a Volt or Saren, a Mirage for your main DPS, and then of course you have your Rhino or Equinox as the buff, in which case you'll be the buff as Rhino, and then you have your Trinity to give you energy. That's typically how an optimized group goes in Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. The next build we're going into is a crowd control build. This is my crowd stomper build. This build is designed to absolutely stop everything at the stomp of your foot, literally. it can be good to lock down interceptions with ease and just make things stop shooting for a damn second. In terms of helmet, you're going to want whatever, really. I use Excalibur's Radial Blind, but this is just, well, it's really not needed. Just press 4, and in most scenarios, you'll be pretty much fine. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 3 Forma. You'll add 2 Narraman, one of which will go on the Aura. Additionally, you'll add 1 Matter Eye. I recommend replacing the 2 default Vazarin to make my other builds work. Going over the mods, starting with the Aura, we're using enemy radar, so we know, where enemies are that need to be stomped. Next, we have Augur Message to bring up our duration a bit. The reason why we want the extra duration is so we have a decent duration on the stun from Iron Stomp. Next, we have Overextended. We don't need ability strength on this build as we are just focusing on keeping things stunned. Obviously, he has a 70-meter radius with max range, so that is incredibly good. We have Stretch to augment this further, as well as Prime Continuity to, of course, bring up our duration, which is then countered by Fleeting Expertise. Obviously, Fleeting Expertise is a bit annoying for a build that wants duration, but compared to my previous crowd control builds, this one costs 100 energy per cast at base efficiency, so it's kind of hard not to have this one. Next, we have Constitution to counterbalance more Fleeting Expertise, of course. And then we have Streamline to further augment our efficiency, bringing it from 40 to 25, which is really nice. And then Augur Reach to finish out some of that range, as well as Cunning Drift, which just gives you max range. This is a max range stomp build. In terms of Arcanes, you're probably going to want Energize. It helps when it procs, but truly isn't necessary, as this is pretty efficient. In terms of Operator School, I would say Zenuric is super needed, as we'll be hitting Stomp quite a bit for 25 energy a cast. It's not too bad, but we aren't really getting energy pickups because things don't need to die. The point of the build is CC, not damage. So a quick how to use. Put simply, you press 4. That's it. I mean, notice how I didn't go near them either. It's got a 70-meter range. I'll show a bit of gameplay of how I use it in an interception, but truly, it's very simple. So you get in, and all you have to do is press 4 when something annoys you. It doesn't get any simpler than this. I like to use this on interceptions simply because, especially on Steel Path, you have enemies all over the place trying to constantly conflict everything. As you can see, enemies way over there are just being affected because, of course, we have that 70-meter range. So this is pretty much how this works in a nutshell. You press 4 every time something annoys you. Next build, we have my Crowd Killer build. This is exactly opposite to Crowd Stomper. One focuses on CC, this one focuses on damage. This build is designed to stomp things to death. It's not practical at all, but it works better than it should, as you'll see in the gameplay I show soon. In terms of helmet, you're going to want Empower to give a quick boost to both Roar and Stomp. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 5 Forma. You'll add 3 Narraman, one of which will go on the Aura. Obviously, the Aura is a bit more optional, but I recommend it or an Aura Forma if you want something else, as my other builds use a Narraman on the Aura as well. Additionally, you'll add 2 Matter Eye, both of which will replace the default Vazarins. Going over the mods, starting with Aura. We're using enemy radar here, so we know when enemies need to be stomped. I mean, just for the same reason as the last build, it's pretty good to know when there's a lot of enemies in range of your stomp. Next, we have Armor Intensify. We're trying to bring up our strength as much as possible to get a good Roar and Rhino stomp damage. Next, we have Reach. This is, of course, to augment our range. We want to be able to hit quite a bit with Rhino stomp, so that, of course, is that. Streamline, just to make this a little bit more efficient, as we are using Blind Rage, which increases our strength a ton, but of course lowers our efficiency. We have Stretch for even more augmented range. And then we have Flow. This is, I guess, an option slot. I use this because you blow through like 150 energy for the rotation that you have to do for this. So I would highly recommend this here, especially if you have something like Energize. It just, being able to bank a ton of energy definitely helps to be able to do this repeatedly. Next, we have Fleeting Expertise. We really don't need duration on this build, but we do need good efficiency, just so we're not blowing through a ton of energy every time we do this. Next, we have Transient Fortitude. Of course, this brings down our duration even more, not a worry. Lastly, we have Transient Fortitude, which brings up our ability strength, but of course sacrifices duration, not really a problem. Then we have Power Drift, which brings up our strength even more for a total of 311% power strength. We're not using a 5 out of 5 power drift here simply because of the fact that it doesn't fit. I have an extra 4 out of 5, so of course I'm using that. In terms of arcanes, you'll most definitely want energized. Anything else is just a bonus. Domestic requirements, I would say a companion running animal instinct will pair nicely with enemy radar, so you are aware of when a good chunk of enemies are in range. Totally optional though. In terms of operator school, I would say Zenuric is pretty mandatory due to the spammy nature of abilities in this build. So a quick how to use, get energy, first of all, since this is a totally inefficient setup. From here, press Empower, then press Roar, then press Empower again, then Stomp. This gives you quite a bit of stomp strength as everything is boosting its damage. Of course, the Roar runs out instantly, but at least it gives you enough time to hit Empower, then Stomp. This entire rotation takes 146 energy, so make sure you are at that when you decide to start the rotation. So here I'm in some gameplay. I'm actually in a Hydron, and I'm just going through the rotation, as you can see, numbers everywhere. And I do it again, but I don't know. This build is kind of niche. I mean, Rhino Stomp actually really doesn't do that much damage, so this falls off pretty hard at level 40 for such a huge setup. So, I mean, take that how you will. Moving on to the last build, which is my Index build. This build is designed to run through Index with a ton of points on your back for the bonus points. You're able to shrug off the debuffs easily with this build and even increases your damage. In terms of helmet, you're going to want Elemental Ward. For Elemental Ward, you just want to make sure your appearance color makes you get the cold type for the bonus armor. The reason we don't use Parasitic Armor here is because in the Index, you have a Financial Stress debuff, which lowers your shield, which makes it weaker than Elemental Ward. In terms of Forma, you're looking at 5 Forma. You'll add 3 Nariman, one of which will go on the Aura. Obviously, the Aura is a bit more optional, but I recommend it or an Aura Forma if you want something else, as my other builds use a Nariman on the Aura as well. Additionally, you'll add 2 Matarai, both of which will replace the default Vazarins. Going over the mods, starting with Enemy Radar, I can't stress Enemy Radar enough. It is incredibly strong in the Index, and if everyone's running it, it makes finding enemies significantly easier. Please run this. Moving along, we have Umbra Intensify to boost strength. As with most builds for Rhino, we want as much strength as possible. This is a good way to do it. Next, we have Narrow-Minded. We do this to increase our duration, and of course, this removes some ability range, but that's not a huge deal. We use Narrow-Minded here instead of something like Umbral Fiber because having higher uptimes on RAWR means we can kill things faster, which means less incoming damage. Big brain. This also doubles for having Elemental Ward a little bit longer too. The reason we don't use Umbral Vitality is because when holding Index points, you can go as low as 10% of your max health. 10% of 1,000 health still isn't great, sitting at 100 health. That's a one-shot without Iron Skin still. So you might as well be at 30 health, which is exactly what this build has, because of course 10% of 300 is only 30 health. Moving on to the next mod, we have Iron Shrapnel. This is obviously just for the convenience of being able to refresh our Iron Skin whenever we want. Obviously, this is a place where we're seriously relying on that Iron Skin, so if it's, you know, a kind of low number and we're like, oh, we want to fix that, we'll be able to do that. Next, we have Transient Fortitude. Of course, we're augmenting our strength a whole bunch. This ruins our duration a little bit, not a huge problem. Augur Secrets. Obviously, we're bringing up our strength even further. Next, we have Fleeting Expertise. This is where the issue kind of lies. So, we want our efficiency to be higher because we want our Elemental Ward and Iron Skin cast to be under 50 energy. And the reason why we do this is because if we do this, even with a high Financial Stress debuff, we'll still be able to cast our buffs as needed. Of course, this ruins our duration, but that's why we have things like Narrow-Minded here, so we can still get use out of things like RAWR, and we have a slightly higher uptime on Elemental Ward. Next, we have Streamline, just to further augment our efficiency. Again, we want to keep a relatively low cost on our abilities, just so all the energy orbs on Index are 50 energy per, so keeping everything under 50 energy is ideal. Lastly, we have Blind Rage, which of course is where most of our efficiency goes out the window, but that is still, of course, enough. In terms of Arcanes, you're going to want something that can maybe increase your damage, and even an Arcane Energize wouldn't hurt. However, these are optional, and the build was designed with no Arcanes in mind.
In terms of misc requirements, just bring friends. Index is always better with friends. In terms of operator school, I would say really anything is fine. I use an Uric to get bonus energy on energy pickups, as well as energizing dash being able to counter some of the financial stress debuff. So a quick how to use, it's easier just to get into some gameplay for this. So going into Index, the first thing we want to do is find 2 energy orbs that will spawn towards the beginning of the mission. Knowing where these energy orb spawns are pretty important, because if your iron skin goes down, you need to go to these points in a rush. So you get your first energy orb and you cast Elemental Ward. You get to your second energy orb, you cast iron skin. Any energy you have left over at this point, put into a RAWR and just absolutely blast everything. Keep in mind that once you are at 20 points, you are capped on bonus points you need to turn in. However, in this example, I demonstrate that if for whatever reason you need to hold on to them for longer, you're able to recast your iron skin, no problem, at full buff and debuff of financial stress with this build. As you can clearly see, you just need to know where those spawns are, and that's it. As you can see, you turn in. There, no problem. 30 points, easy. So that is the complete Rhino guide. He is pretty damn good. If you enjoyed the video, or it helped in any way, please leave a like. And if you're looking forward to future content like this, subscribe and stay tuned. If I miss anything or you'd like to leave some feedback, leave it down in the comments. I appreciate all the support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.